Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. This time we're going to take a look at the attack that happened on Bourbon Street in New Orleans on New Year's Day 2025. And we've got a bunch of different sources to really dig into: news articles, witness statements, official reports.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating because it seems like we're not just dealing with dry facts. These sources really capture the emotions, the confusion.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It's early morning, January 1st, 2025. Bourbon Street is packed with people celebrating New Year's.
Right, picture it. Music, crowds, the whole energy of New Year's Eve. Suddenly, a white Ford F-150 pickup truck comes barreling down the street.
That high speed.
Yeah, super high speed. People said it was just absolute chaos, people being hit, screams, just total pandemonium.
And the driver, later identified as Shamsud-Din Bahar, he ends up crashing. He gets out of the truck, and then there's an exchange of gunfire with police. He's eventually killed. And the aftermath is just devastating. 15 people dead, over 30 injured.
It's just awful. I mean, the witness testimonies are just chilling. People describing it as a war zone, like a nightmare. Their words really paint a picture of just how violent and intentional this was.
And all this happened just hours before the Sugar Bowl, one of the biggest college football games, was supposed to start at the Superdome.
Oh, yeah. You can imagine the immediate concerns, right? Officials had this huge decision to make: postpone the game or go ahead as planned.
Postponing would disrupt everything, obviously disappoint fans, but going ahead could risk more people getting hurt. It's like security versus just trying to maintain some normalcy.
Exactly. And the sources we have, they really delve into that struggle, that back and forth.
Ultimately, they decided to postpone the game for 24 hours. But this whole thing, it really exposes how vulnerable even places we think are safe can be. Your sources mention these things called bollards.
Oh, right, yeah. Bollards are those posts, those retractable posts you see a lot in areas with heavy foot traffic.
To stop vehicles.
Yeah, like heavy-duty barriers. And the ones on Bourbon Street, they were actually malfunctioning at the time of the attack, under repair. They weren't in place to stop that truck.
It's kind of scary to think that such a seemingly small detail could have such horrific consequences.
It's a tough lesson. But it really highlights how important these small details are, especially when we're talking about keeping the public safe.
For sure. So let's talk about the man behind the wheel, Shamsud-Din Bahar. What can you tell us about him?
Well, the sources paint a bit of a complicated picture, which, makes this whole thing even more interesting to dig into. Jabbar was 42 years old, a U.S. Army veteran. He'd served in Afghanistan, got an honorable discharge, and then he worked in real estate as a business developer, even a data engineer.
It's not what you'd typically think of when you hear about someone committing an attack like this.
Right. It's not the usual profile, is it? And that's what's so puzzling. The sources also mention he'd missed some child support payments, so maybe some financial stress was a factor. But it's just, you have this accomplished guy, but then these hints of personal problems.
Right, like maybe there's more to this story than we initially thought.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely challenges any assumptions we might have about what motivates someone to do something like this.
I agree. And speaking of assumptions, there was actually some confusion at first about whether this attack was even considered terrorism.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
The mayor of New Orleans was quick to call it terrorism, but the local FBI, they weren't so sure at first. Later, the Attorney General and the FBI in Washington, they both confirmed that they were investigating it as terrorism.
So what changed their minds?
Well, a couple of things came to light. First, they found an ISIS flag in Jabbar's truck. Yeah, and then they found what looked like IEDs, improvised explosive devices, not only in the truck, but apparently planted around the French Quarter as well. So suddenly, it wasn't just a random act of violence, it was something way more planned out.
And way scarier. And then there's this police bulletin you mentioned describing security footage that shows 3 men and a woman planting one of these devices. What do we know about that?
That's a big one because it suggests that Jabbar wasn't working alone. And the FBI has even said they're looking for accomplices. So then you have all these new questions. Who are these people? How are they connected to Jabbar? Were they the masterminds or just following orders?
It really starts to feel like a much bigger story. And it's interesting because all of this happened against the backdrop of those pro-ISIS messages going around online calling for attacks on New Year's Eve.
Right, and that raises another question. What part did the internet play in all of this? Was Jabbar radicalized online? Did he meet these potential accomplices online? This whole incident really highlights how extremism can flourish online.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought, the digital world colliding with real-world violence. So, how did New Orleans react to all of this? How did the city cope in the aftermath?
Well, the sources paint a picture of a city in shock. Bourbon Street, usually known for its nightlife, was eerily quiet. There are quotes from residents talking about feeling numb, heartbroken, like the spirit of the city had been attacked.
It's tough to imagine that energy and joy just being snuffed out like that.
I know, and one resident said something that really resonated with me. I never thought I'd see the day when this city wouldn't be filled with music. It just speaks to that feeling of loss, like something precious had been taken away.
And in the midst of all of this, you have the stories of the victims. We have Tiger Betch, a former Princeton football player, Nakira Dido, who was studying to be a nurse, Nicole Perez, a single mother, and Reggie Hunter, who just decided to go to Bourbon Street on a whim that night.
Yeah, it really drives home that these are real people, not just statistics. Real people whose lives were cut short. It's a reminder of the human cost of this attack.
So you have this city in mourning trying to come to grips with what happened. But then there's this other huge event looming, the Super Bowl, just a few weeks away. What did they do to prepare for that?
Well, the Louisiana governor declared a state of emergency and called in the National Guard for extra security. It shows how seriously they were taking the situation.
And that kind of brings us to another layer of this whole story. Was this attack in New Orleans an isolated incident? Or is there something more going on? Could this be connected to other things happening in the country or even around the world?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's exactly what we're going to dig into next. Welcome back. So we were just talking about whether this attack could be part of something bigger, something beyond New Orleans.
It's like, when you drop a pebble in a pond, those ripples just keep spreading out. It feels like this attack, it could be a ripple from something much larger.
I like that analogy, and it's actually how intelligence agencies think, too. They're always looking for those connections, those patterns.
Right, trying to see the bigger picture. And speaking of the bigger picture, you mentioned that there was a conflict going on between Israel and Hamas at the time. Could that be a factor here?
Yeah, absolutely. Global events like that, they can definitely create this sense of tension, this unrest, and that can, sometimes inspire people to act out.
It's like a powder keg.
Hmm.
And it wasn't just the Israel-Hamas situation. The FBI had actually put out warnings about increased extremist activity before the attack, right?
That's right. According to the sources, the FBI had already stopped a few potential attacks in the months leading up to New Year's Day. There was one in Oklahoma, I think, that was supposed to happen on Election Day.
So it sounds like they were already on high alert, but this still slipped through.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, how can we possibly prepare for something like this if even the FBI can't always stop it?
It's tough. It's like you can build barriers, you can increase surveillance, but there's always a chance that something will get through.
And those malfunctioning bollards, the police superintendent saying their plan was defeated, it all just feels a little unnerving.
Yeah, I get it. It shows that security is never perfect, no matter how hard we try. And it kind of brings us back to that question we touched on before. Should they have postponed the Sugar Bowl? Was it the right call?
There are definitely strong opinions on both sides. Some people thought it was a sign of weakness, like giving in to fear, but others were worried about another attack happening.
It's a fascinating debate, isn't it? And it shows just how hard it is to make those kinds of decisions in these situations.
Because it's not just logistics, it's symbolic too. Does postponing a huge event like the Sugar Bowl mean that the terrorists win? Does it just create more fear?
Those are important questions. But we also have to think about what could have happened if they hadn't postponed it, if there had been another attack.
Right, the potential consequences.
Exactly. It all comes down to this balance between security and our freedom. How do we protect people without letting fear take over everything?
It's a tough balance. So let's talk about the people of New Orleans for a minute. I mean, they're known for being resilient, for celebrating life, even in the face of adversity. But this attack, it felt different.
It did. This attack, it was an attack on what New Orleans stands for, the music, the vibrancy, the joy, and to have that violated, to have that taken away, it's deeply traumatic.
Remember that quote from one of the residents we talked about earlier? They said they never thought they'd see the day when their city wasn't filled with music.
Yeah, that one really hit home for me. It speaks to the emotional impact of this whole thing. And it's not just about the physical damage, it's about those psychological scars that an attack like this leaves behind.
It must have been incredibly difficult for them to then have to prepare for the Super Bowl just a few weeks later.
Absolutely. Going from a state of mourning and high security to trying to welcome people from all over the world for this huge celebration, it's a big shift.
But you can't just erase what happened. How do you convince people that it's safe to come to New Orleans, to celebrate, to enjoy themselves?
It's a challenge for sure. And The sources, they show that officials were really struggling with that. They increased security, brought in the National Guard, really tried to send the message that the city was resilient and prepared.
Did they ever find any connections between this attack and those other incidents that the FBI had been investigating, like the one you mentioned in Oklahoma?
Well, the sources we have, they mainly focus on the New Orleans attack, but they do hint that there might be broader connections. The investigation is still going on, so I'm sure those are some of the things they're trying to figure out.
So was Jabbar actually part of a larger group? Or maybe he was just inspired by those other plots.
Oh,
Makes
no.
you wonder.
And that leads to a really crucial question. Was this a lone wolf attack, or was Jabbar part of something more organized, something with deeper roots? That's what we're going to delve into in the last part of our deep dive.
We're back for the final part of our deep dive. And we left off with this question. Was Jabbar a lone wolf, or was he part of something bigger?
It's like we're putting together a puzzle, right? We have all these pieces of information. The ISIS flag in the truck. The IEDs. That surveillance footage of those three men and a woman planting a device.
It definitely points to something more than just one person acting alone.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that Jabbar wasn't operating in a vacuum. And the FBI has even said outright that they don't think he acted alone. They're looking for accomplices.
Which means they must have some evidence that suggests others were involved.
Exactly. But then there's Jabbar himself. We talked about his military background, his successful career. It's just hard to wrap your head around how someone like that could do something so horrific.
Yeah. What could push someone down that path?
I mean, that's the big mystery, isn't it?
Mhm.
What was the turning point for him? Was it something from his time in the military? Did he have some kind of personal crisis? Or was it something more recent? Something he encountered online, maybe?
The sources mentioned that he posted some disturbing things on social media before the attack, talking about wanting to kill, referencing ISIS, and then there was that online message urging people to attack on New Year's Eve.
Right, and that's the thing about the internet. It can be a breeding ground for this kind of extremist thinking.
It's where people can connect with others who share their views, get radicalized.
And it shows how the online world can have real consequences in the real world. Consequences that can be absolutely devastating.
So are there any clues about who these accomplices might be, what their connection to Jabbar was?
Well, the sources we have, they don't really go into much detail about the investigation itself. They're probably keeping that information quiet for now.
That makes sense.
But I'm sure investigators are looking into everything, his personal contacts, his online activity, any links to extremist groups. But it does feel like we're left with more questions than answers.
It does.
And that's how it often is with these kinds of events. The full story might not come out for a while.
Yeah, it takes time.
But by looking at what we do know, we can start to understand what happened, what it means.
Okay, so we've covered a lot: the attack, the suspect, the possibility of a wider network.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to the Sugar Bowl for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
That decision to postpone it, it caused quite a stir.
Yeah, for sure. It was a tough call. Some people thought it was giving in to the terrorists, showing weakness.
But then others were worried about another attack happening.
Right, and that's the thing about terrorism. It forces leaders to make these impossible choices. How do you keep people safe without giving in to fear?
There's a quote from one of the security experts in the sources that really stuck with me. He said, "We can't eliminate risk entirely, but we can try to minimize it."
That's a good point. We have to accept that there's always going to be some level of risk, but we can do things to make ourselves less vulnerable.
Okay, so as we wrap things up, what are the big takeaways from all of this?
Well, I think this attack shows how terrorism is changing. It's not just about big organizations anymore. It's lone wolves, people getting radicalized online. It makes it much harder to predict and prevent these kinds of attacks.
That's scary.
And we also see how hard it is to find that balance between security and freedom. How do we protect ourselves without becoming a society that's ruled by fear? It's something we need to keep thinking about.
And we can't forget about the human cost of all of this. The victims, their families, the city of New Orleans. The impact of this attack is going to be felt for a long time.
Yeah, it will.
One thought that I keep coming back to is this: how do we build a world where understanding and empathy are stronger than hate and violence?
That's a big question, but it's one we need to keep asking ourselves, both as individuals and as a society.
Well said. Thank you all for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it gave you some insights into this complex and tragic event.